So to me, a lot of my meaning in life comes from learning, continuous learning, and more of late. So living well to me means being onto something, to learning something that I didn't know before that helps me integrate everything that came before.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Reflections on Living Well podcast, where we explore perspectives on the good life in the 21st century. I am your host, Broderick Rodell. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Reflections on Living Well podcast. Today, our guest is Ward Mailliard. Ward is one of the founders of Mount Madonna Center, where he has been a builder, teacher, and administrator since its beginning in 1978. SN, as he is known, served as president of the Hanuman Fellowship Board and taught at Mount Madonna School for over 3 decades, and continues as an advisory trustee of the orphanage and school project in India. He has been a student of Baba Haridas and of Ashtanga Yoga since 1974 and has been an instructor in the Mount Madonna Institute Yoga Teacher Training Program since its inception in 1979. He has a continuing interest in how we can rehumanize learning to best support the emergence of the caring, responsible citizens the world now needs. He and his wife, Kranti, live at Mount Madonna Center and continue to be vitally involved in the ongoing evolution of the community. Hey, how you doing, SN?
I'm good, thank you.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have you on this podcast to share your wisdom from your life experiences and the many explorations that you've had in your life. I think that the audience is going to benefit tremendously from that wisdom and these experiences that you've had and education and building a retreat center and lots of stuff that we hopefully will dig into a little bit in this conversation. So I know I just read that introduction, but I also like to ask guests to kind of share um, their way of describing themselves. So how do you like to introduce yourself other than that thing I just read?
It's a pretty much a moving target, right? We go through
Mm-hmm.
stages in life. And so what you've done is identified my chronology. Um, these days, I guess I'm staying curious. I'm a learner. My learning falls into kind of two aspects. One is I'm continuing to learn myself as a participant in this process we call life, and I'm trying to understand other. And I think those are the two requirements to understand the observer, that's us, and the medium in which we live. And so therein lies the challenge. These days, well, I'm about to head to India on Sunday for to continue supervising construction over there of the school addition that we're adding at the orphanage that we sponsor, that was also inspired by Baba Haridas. And for the rest of the time, facilitating conversations that essentially do the same thing, reveal people to themselves and to each other. So I would say that's pretty much it these days. And whatever I'm asked to do,
Nice.
you know, like do a podcast with Broderick.
That sounds wonderful. I see that you're still you're a student. You're a student of life. You're continually learning,
Oh,
and
yeah.
I love how you identify yourself. You like to describe yourself in terms of your interest in learning about yourself
Yeah.
continuously and about the world that you live in, and also doing service. I hope we unpack a little bit more of that as we go, because I would like to know what draws you to do this type of work. So the very first question I like to ask after that is, what does living well mean to you, and what is the good life? And then we'll unpack it from here based on what you say.
Yeah. Um, that's almost like an advice question, but since you said, what does it mean to me? That makes it a more difficult question in some respects because the question is, what are you doing? Because I think we all are searching for meaning and purpose, and we just define that differently. And for me personally, I think I'm sort of a questing beast. I like to be onto something. To be onto something to me is everything. Where I'm excited about learning or doing something that has meaning to me. And oh gosh, there's so many roots and branches there. On the learning end of it, Vinoba Bhave, who was Gandhi's chief disciple, who was of equal stature, I think, was a teacher. And he's most known for the Bhudan movement, which is after uh, India attained its independence. He walked throughout India, walked. He wouldn't ride in any vehicle, and uh, persuaded people to give land to the landless. And he was
Mm.
able to just collect and distribute over 1 million acres of land in that process. And I worked with Nirmala Deshpande, who was his disciple, who took over eventually the Harjan Sevak Society, which is what Gandhi created to serve the poorest of the poor. And when Vinoba Bhave was on his deathbed, so to speak, he had a stack of books beside him, and someone said, Vinoba, you have these books. You're dying. Why do you need books? And he said very simply, if I'm not learning, I can't teach. So to me, a lot of my meaning in life comes from learning, continuous learning, and more of late. So living well to me means being onto something, to learning something that I didn't know before that helps me integrate everything that came before. So that's one aspect. And the other is feeling useful. And I think that's probably based on childhood trauma, which is the belief that to exist, I needed to serve in some capacity. And of course, that's all based on a mental computation of what that is, what's worth doing, what is service. But for me, I think it's somewhat pathological in that I feel better when I accomplish something in the day that looks like it might be helpful to others. And that's helpful to me. So, it's a mixed bag there.
Mm.
So, beyond that, I just think everybody has to figure that out for themselves and does figure it out for themselves. And so, advice in that area, I suppose if you model something and somebody admires it, it's speaking to something that's already in them. So I'm not big on
Mm.
advice, and I'm not sure I'm even that big on being a model, to tell you the truth. Life's not easy for anybody, So we all face our challenges. So I guess
Mhm.
living well means learning and being useful.
Mhm. That's awesome. I love that. I love again your desire to continue to learn, and there's a certain kind of humility that comes with that. And I personally think that's important as well. Being humble and being open, because I love that story of that gentleman who was on his deathbed saying that no, I'm still learning, I'm still teaching, And I think it goes to what you were saying about being a model. Even if we don't want to be one, we are.
Yeah.
And I guess it's our duty to to continue to learn, and because we teach by our being and our
Okay.
actions in the world. And I really love it. Even if you're on your deathbed, you can still you're still teaching, and just for me to hear that story is like, oh yeah, I learned something from that. Yes, I can keep learning. And I think that's the idea behind this podcast too. It's not so much advice. It's having people share their personal experiences. And like you said, maybe we can glean something from their experiences and their perspective,
Yeah.
and see what can we apply it in our lives and see as it touches on something inside of us.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so
There's no
that's awesome.
negation there. I'm just saying,
Mm-hmm.
you know, uh, I'm trying to, uh, well, here's another example, Thomas Merton. And a friend of mine's written a couple books on him. So I've read a couple of books on him, the ones he wrote. And the last one he wrote, what I gleaned from it, I hope correctly, but who knows, was that Thomas Merton thought that if he could understand or if he could know his authentic self, he would know God. And of course, that requires a lot of commentary. But the point basically was that he decided that in order to know his authentic self, he had to rid himself of all the false narratives that were drivers
Mm.
in his life. You know, things that people tell us that we should do, um, elements of trauma and decisions and relationships we have with trauma and experience, and what description and explanation we have of those. And so I think that the human job is as this amazing human being, Dr. Kshama Maitre, that I have known for a number of years in India, who runs the Chinmayananda Outreach for Rural Development Project. Very wise, deep learner herself. And I would take my students to meet her and talk to her when I would take them to India as a way of creating a transformational experience. And we would always ask at the end of the interviews that we did, which is part of what my curriculum was about, what advice do you have for us? Which is ironic in that I have decided that advice is something to be careful with. But she got very quiet for a minute. And then, with the kind of gravitas of somebody who is talking from deep experience, simply said, know yourself. That's it.
Mm.
And that's what I think Thomas Merton's message is to learn yourself as the instrument of observing the world. Because the world that we observe is not separate from the instrument of observation. And so we all see the world differently. And we all have different, pardon me for using a big word, but epistemologies. And by that, I mean, how do we know what we know? How do we decide what we decide? How do we explain what we explain? How do we choose what we choose? So epistemology is really the study of knowing, that process of knowing. And so if we don't question how we know things, then we're assuming that the world is some kind of objective place that we can identify and we know the truth of it, the truth of it. And as it turns out, we live in this multiverse of individual, we could say, ways of seeing the world and understanding the world, or we could say of different epistemologies. And in order to understand ourselves and the others, we really have some process of self-reflection that we have to be part of in order to understand the seer. Why do I observe the world the way I do? how do I code the messages coming from the world? What's the logical hierarchy of what triggers me and what doesn't? Why do I do what I do?
Mm-hmm.
Why do I respond the way I respond? So I think that, to me personally, is my own journey, is trying to understand better so that I create less harm in the world, from being unconscious about what I do and how it impacts others.
Mm. Absolutely beautiful, San. I love it. And yeah, I resonate with so much of that. I think all of that is so important. I think you're really hitting on the value of learning again, and learning oneself, and seeing how oneself is integrated into the world, or a reflection of the world, however one wants to look at that. All of that is so rich and important. So how did you get to all of this? Where did this come from? The interest in these things. Can you give a little historical background of how you got to see things this way, and what inspired you? As much as you like to share, of course.
Oh gosh, trail of tears and mistakes and hard knocks and all of that. Well, I think the journey of self discovery is rooted in suffering or disappointment. When I was a teenager, well, let's say when I was when I was in my early 20s, I thought I knew things. And I governed my life by the belief that because I knew things and that I was right, I could accomplish things without really understanding the totality of things. And so, uh, well, in specific, I decided to buy a music club that was for sale, a rock and roll club. And so for 4 years, I was in the rock and roll business, hiring bands 7 nights a week. I realized
Wow.
6 months in that the metaphor that I would be happy if I was in charge of something turned out to be a slightly toxic metaphor, as Mary Catherine Bateson would have said. And I just made a decision that I had gotten myself into something that I really, now that I understood it, I didn't know what I didn't know at the time, that it was something I didn't really want to do and wasn't ultimately useful on my journey, except as a lesson or two or three or 100 that I got along the way. But I decided that as a matter of character development, I shouldn't just drop and run, but finish it. So I spent 3.5 more years, quote, finishing it without really knowing what that meant until suddenly I realized I was done and it was time to sell it and move on. The day I sold it, I met Baba Haridas, the very day, 4th of July, 1974, ironically. And, the process of that had turned me towards a self inquiry, or a spiritual inquiry, if you called it in those days. And I met him, and I spoke with him, and uh, he was very clear in his response. At that time, I was feeling pretty down, like, God, how could I have been so stupid? I really failed and wasted time. And he wrote on his chalkboard, because he didn't speak. I never heard him speak, but he wrote on his chalkboard, failure makes you strong. And I thought, okay, I don't feel very strong. But anyway, I started studying yoga with him. I'd started it actually a little bit earlier to kind of deal with the vicissitudes of a 7 day a week um, job, so to speak. Um, and got involved with the Hanuman Fellowship, and they were pretty disorganized at that time. And I think I had some sort of basic uh, tendency towards organization. I was needed, and that was where meaning was for me, was being needed and being useful. So I kind of hopped on that train, and here it is almost 50 years later. It'll be 50 years on the 4th of July, and everything has transpired. We built Mount Madonna Center. We built Sri Ram Ashram, the orphanage. We built Mount Madonna School. Um, and I think at that point, I was more than willing to trade work for self-esteem and and be involved with good people who were also contributing, and then dealing with all of the learning and all of the mistakes and all of the kind of shifts of self-awareness and ego consciousness and so on that were taking place not only by doing spiritual practice, meditation and asana and pranayama and so on, but in the day-to-day life of kind of the school of hard knocks, where so one thing led to another. At one point, I met this woman who worked with us for a while as a consultant, and Vivian Wright, who had been a consultant for HP. And she told me something very important. She said, have you noticed that when you get curious, that that is like your future calling you, and that you should follow your curiosity? And I realized that by following my curiosity, I developed things that were useful to the organization. So curiosity became more of a conscious thing for me, of going, oh, I'm curious in this. All right, let's go follow it and see where it leads. And that's never left me. And through that, I've had so many teachers. Margaret Wheatley, who was a organizational development person who I met just by accident. She introduced me to Peter Block, who I've worked with for a number of years, who was also an extraordinary organizational development person who really changed my whole teaching format from that of answers to questions, and on and on. Humberto Maturana, the cultural biologist from Chile who passed away a few years ago, I had the opportunity to work with him, learned a tremendous amount from him. Gregory Bateson, whose wife Lois found this property, and we went to talk to when we started Mount Madonna to get advice, because he was a very wise man. He was an anthropologist and a cyberneticist, and brilliant. And he said something that now strikes me as truer the longer I live, which is be your own anthropologist. In other words, take a step back and try to understand as a community what the anthropology of the community is, so that you can understand it. So I've also studied his stuff and still studying his stuff. So the answer is a lot of happy accidents. None of this was planned, but I seemed to run into the people at the right time to help me move along a path of learning. And when I discovered I never liked school, but I love learning. And I think part of my role as an educator is really to challenge the dominant narratives around school, because I think they're producing a world we don't want, or they're exacerbating the world we're creating. So I'm sorry, that's kind of a circuitous thing, but it's been a circuitous path, that it hasn't been a straight line, And so, and I could probably also say, I don't know, it just happened. Yeah.
Right.
Maybe that would have
Absolutely. No, some context, some details were nice. But ultimately, yeah.
All description.
I know, right? No. That's just great though, because I think, again, an opportunity for us. I'm here, I'm listening to stories I haven't heard before, and I'm learning so much from that. I think you touched on so many things. Challenge it, how challenge facilitates,
Oh yeah.
um, sparks this process of learning. There's curiosity, but you keep coming back to learning, 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 learning.
Mm.
Boy, I so resonate with that, because how else do we know? I don't, by the way, I'm doing this podcast. I don't think that there's no one way of living well, but I do think there's some common themes,
Oh yeah.
but we have to find it. But hearing these stories, because I don't know, I'm trying to learn, I'm trying to figure this thing out myself.
Yeah.
And what you shared is some things that I think we all can learn from.
Mm.
There are some happy accidents. Things kind of come in our lives when we need them, when we think we don't need it, but it kind of comes in our lives and kind of shakes things up for us, especially when we think we know, we got to figure it out. And life has a way of showing us that nope, you do not have it figured out.
Yeah.
And I think that seems to be a big part of your story, is as we go through life and if we're open, if we're aware, and if we're curious, things kind of come into our lives to kind of shake things up a little bit and gives us the opportunity to learn how to move and transcend that. You talked about a lot of different characters in your life that are big thinkers, and how they inspired you on your journey because there was a challenge of some sort and then the curiosity. So with all of that, I can see that common theme of curiosity that's been in you. Is there something in you, some driving force in you that you think that's kind of has sustained you through this process? What is it about you think that has compelled you to move and continue to learn and have this fire to continue to learn and grow?
Um, well, I mean, I think we're driven by our compulsions of meaning and purpose.
Mm.
And I think that pretty much goes for everybody. And I'll go back to what Mary Catherine said. She said, this was Gregory's daughter, who is also a giant in her own right. Sadly, at this point where I'd really like to talk to her again, she's gone. But, and Gregory too, it took me many years to get the courage to dive into their work because it's very hard to understand. But one time I was talking to her, and she, when she was at Mount Madonna, and she said, um, "There's nothing as toxic as bad metaphor." And I knew that she'd said something that mattered to me. I just couldn't figure out what it meant. And it took me about at least 10 years to figure that out. I'd almost have it, and then it would slip away. And then finally I got it. And it also says in the Bhagavad Gita the same thing in a different language. So Krishna, who represents consciousness, says, whatever God you worship, I stabilize your faith in that. So whatever you're seeking, consciousness itself and concentration stabilizes your faith and your journey towards that. And then he says, and then you achieve that heaven by your merit. But when the merit is exhausted, you come back. But if you worship me, consciousness, and I don't mean as an other, but if you practice becoming more conscious, when you become fully conscious, you don't come back. Now, in that are all kinds of mythologies and ideas that have been manipulated and expressed in many ways. But I think that in general in life, we live metaphorically in that we find things that we think are worth doing or having, and when we do them and have them, they ultimately aren't the ultimate thing. And so we move on. So, gosh, if I had an iPhone, my life would be perfect. And I have the iPhone, and then I need the 13th, 14th, 15th iPhone. But when we've satisfied a desire, it satisfies us for a little bit, but then we're yearning for something else. So, what's the ultimate learning is the question. Where do you stop?
Mm.
And so it's all metaphorical in that sense for some innate yearning that I think lies at the heart of all human beings that either gets satisfied and you move on, or doesn't get satisfied and you feel defeated, or you're in the process of getting there. And then how much is enough? So obviously, people competing to be the richest person in the world have one metaphor. A person spending their time trying to alleviate suffering has a different metaphor.
Mm.
And so we create ourselves by what we choose to notice, and what we notice is the yearning and what we're aspiring to. So I can honestly say that many years that somebody might look at as service for me in 50 years of working with this institution, we're really working out other things, like the need to be in charge, the need to be right, the need to be noticed, the need to, and so on. The need is and finally the root need to be useful as a way of creating a sense of meaning, purpose, and being. In other words, justifying my being alive. So multiple levels on all of this stuff. So it's not so easy to figure out. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think we do live metaphorically at so many levels. And so I've been studying some neurobiology. I've been studying cultural biology. I've been studying Gregory's work. He wrote this book called Where Angels Fear, which was towards a new epistemology of the sacred. In other words, what do we think the sacred is? And then I think there's another really important part to this, is that we're all on an individual journey of serving our own explanation for what's worth doing in the world. And I think that that's important and justified as long as it's balanced with not harming others or not harming the environment. I mean, this is just what I think. These are opinions. These are not facts. These are opinions, okay?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to pretend like I am the knower, because honestly, tomorrow I may learn something and I might change my mind, So at this point, this is what I think. I have lots of opinions. I'm never free of opinions, but I've learned that those opinions are not facts necessarily. But yeah, it's kind of, wow, I could simplify that, know yourself, learn yourself, give yourself some agency, but balance that with the agency of those around you, which means to respect those around you, respect nature, and so on. And I think that the narratives that we're in right now, socially, culturally, globally, we've lost sight of nature. And coincidentally, we've lost sight of ourself, separate from the false narratives that are driving us about what is meaning, what is enough, what is success, and it would have to be obvious if you stood back and looked that our success as an individual, while destroying the very thing that we depend on, nature, probably is. in the long run. And it's either you don't care or you're unaware,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So
Beautiful. I think I love how the metaphors we tell ourselves, and we take these metaphors as true, and these metaphors are expressions of opinions, some opinion that we've extracted from someone else, and we take it as fact. I think everything is a metaphor, and really, we don't know what reality really is, but we use all these metaphors through stories to help us navigate. But the problem comes when we think that the metaphor is it, and we think we got it all figured out. It's the ultimate truth. This is a fact.
yeah.
And I'm like, no, it's not. And
Beware,
that's what kind of limits it.
beware
What do
orthodoxy.
you say?
Beware of.
Yes, right. Exactly. And we become fundamentalistic about it. And we say that everybody else is fundamentalistic and I'm not because of whatever belief system I have. And I'm like, well, we actually all have to do that to some capacity.
Oh yeah,
I think you're really hitting on this idea. I mean, I guess because I just resonated with it so much, of learning. You have to be open to learning.
yeah,
That yearning for meaning and purpose as a driver, and open to learning and having that aspiration for the acquisition of some kind of knowledge that's going to guide me in my life.
yeah.
But I think sometimes a lot of us are just unaware of it. We're unaware that the story that we're telling ourselves is a metaphor. That's what it is. And how do we learn that as Sam? I know you've been an educator probably your whole life. As an educator, or just any thoughts, any opinions that you have about how do we learn to see the story that we're telling ourselves is a metaphor, for example? You can
Yeah.
answer however you want, but that's just yeah.
Well, lately, lately I was thinking, why don't we have classes in school on the human operating system?
Yes.
In other words, there's an operating system to human beings. We know a lot now, or at
Mm-hmm.
least we've advanced our not knowing to less not knowing in some areas.
Right.
and, so I think I don't even want to attack false metaphors. I mean, this is something that came from Maturana's world, and um, basically, if we adopt the notion that I'm learning and I may know some things, and I have a belief system, we're not value free. I think even people who are headed in the wrong direction have values. We're not value free.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but what he kind of came down to was, oh, it's here a basic logic train. The fundamental operation of any observer, human beings are observing the world, right, is that of making distinctions. So, how can we make better distinctions? Would be a question. And then the second
Mm-hmm.
notion is that all living things exist within a medium or a context. So, how do I understand myself? How do I understand my context? Right. And then the really interesting thing, the wiggle in this one, is that the medium can perturb us, but it doesn't specify our response. We're responsible for how we respond to the medium, either consciously or unconsciously. We choose to respond. Now, if you don't know you have a choice, you don't have a choice. So that would say, well, maybe I should become more aware of my choices. I could go this way or that way. Well, why do I choose what I choose? Well, then we need to start looking at neurobiology and psychology and anthropology and so on, because we're conditioned from the moment we're born, maybe before
Mm-hmm.
we're born. I mean, we get DNA and RNA and stuff like that is somewhat determinate. But after that, we enter into a context. And in that context, we're shaped by the context. Culture is, or context is quite decisive because it's like the water that you swim in to the extent that you don't even know there's water there. So that's why
Mm-hmm.
challenging one's assumptions is useful, but also quite troublesome to the people around you, because
Mm-hmm.
basically what we're trying to do is create a stable culture with certain values in order to have stability so people can get on with their lives. But stability uh, is not, if you take a biological body, stability is actually a whole bunch of things responding and reacting to each other within the system: body temperature, uh, uh, the peptides, the way the mind body complex interacts with itself, DNA strands doing what they do, the environment that's impacting that, and so on. That in order to maintain balance, there's a lot of things that we have to do. But stability is not standing still and nothing happening. It's like a person on a tightrope with a balance bar. You're constantly rebalancing in order to be stable. So I think if we could develop a cultural understanding of um, the fact that the accepted truth, what Milan Kundera called the non-thought of received ideas,
Hmm.
that's dangerous because then in that mindset we can go right off the cliff. I think
Yeah.
no, it was Ellul that said that, and then Milan Kundera called that the modernization of stupidity, the non-thought of received ideas. So I think questioning is important. And from the Buddhist perspective, challenging assumptions is an important part of the game of life. And so we have a lot of methodologies that are rooted in the ancient. I've studied Panikar's work on the Vedas, the Vedic experience, and another tough book to read. But he's essentially saying the same thing. So in relationship to what Maturana said was that our fundamental operation is to observe, right? And that we're impacted by the world, right? But we choose how to respond. He wrote a whole book on the principle of Advaita. And what is Advaita? When I first joined the Haridas gang, somebody told me, "Oh yeah, he's an Advaitin," and I thought to myself, "What the heck is that?" And they said, and then I said, "What the heck is that?" And they said, "Oh, qualified non-dualism." And I said, "Oh, thank you very much." And then I thought, "What the heck is that?" So it wasn't until I stumbled 50 years later onto Panakar, or 45 years later onto Panakar, to realize that it qualified non-dualism is vested in the principle of distinct but not separate. So as we
Mm-hmm.
observe the world, we're not separate from the thing we're observing. We're actually creating it in our mind as a reflection.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're seeing the world through our own epistemology, through our own experience, through our own trauma, through our own predispositions. So maybe the number one thing for kids to learn is that they have predispositions to things and that their first reaction to things is going to be culturally driven or environmentally driven or you know so predisposition, and I use that instead of bias because bias implies consciousness and predisposition for me does not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so to realize that, oh, okay, I'm predispositioned to think this way, but is that the right way to think? you know Now some things are acceptable and generally accepted and do no harm, so we don't need to bother with most of those things. But when we see ourselves triggered by events, the time when we're least likely to be self-aware is the most important time
Mm-hmm.
to become aware of, oh, I'm really reacting here. How come? And then, of course, probably we all need therapists. I have not had the virtue of
Right.
finding a therapist. When I probably really needed one, I couldn't afford one. And so now I guess I'm uh, sharing the couch with myself these days, trying to figure out, why did I do that? The 3 o'clock wake
Mm-hmm.
up. Oh my God, what did I do? I need to apologize for that. Why did I do that? Anyway, so this is just being human and to know that you can change. In yoga terms, we have samskaras, tendencies. And with a lot of
Mm-hmm.
work and practice, those tendencies can change. That's
Mm-hmm.
what why Babaji always used to say to many questions, how do I do this? How do I do that? And he would say, regular practice, regular sadhana, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But when we hear the words without having some explanation of that, we're all practicing being alive. And the question is, what is my practice? And is it really serving me? And is it serving the environment and my fellow human beings? So it really comes down to a fairly simple question that doesn't have a simple answer.
Yeah.
It's simple. It's simple, but it's hard. You know. So
Yes.
so the last piece of this is that Maturana essentially says we live in a multiverse, which means that we're all seeing it from our own universe. Inside here is a universe. Panakar called it the crossing of threads, that each of us is a knot with a crossing of threads. And those threads are unique that they cross at you. Nobody else like you, right? No other you than you, right? And so how do we adjudicate our multiverse? And his answer to that was allowing the arising of the legitimacy of other. Even if I don't think
Mm-hmm.
the outcomes are equally desirable, I can be curious about how you think and why you think the way you think as a way of opening a dialogue through curiosity and rather than reaction. Because often when people have radically different ideas than ours, we feel like we're going to disappear in listening. And so, how do we
Mm-hmm.
stand back from that and overcome that fear and get curious? And as you see right now, the world is becoming more stratified. And we unfortunately have given permission for things to arise as representative reactions to something that may have more information in it than we're thinking, other than what people stand for. But the question is, why do they stand for what they stand for? What's their epistemology?
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah.
So I don't. I think if we don't get curious about, I'm deeply curious. You know, I keep thinking, gosh, I want to have a conversation with someone I really disagree with, and be be together enough not to go into reaction and think that, you know, this person is a terrible person. So I don't know. I mean, that's the bottom line. I don't know. But
I love.
the idea of allowing the other to arise as a legitimate other, and then there was a corollary to that, which is allowing for the arising of the legitimacy of other, which might also be yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think a lot of us are deeply wounded where we don't see the legitimacy legitimacy of ourselves, and we live in response to the approval of others. And we never really know what we think, because there's a kind of a paralysis of being able to feel what you feel when in relationship. And of course, this is all about relationship. Human beings are relational creatures. We live in relationship to each other, to nature, to events, to God, if you have a God. In the Advaita principle, God is not separate from human beings. Distinct, but not separate. Consciousness in a human being, so that we're actually co-creating, we can tell now as we're destroying our environment, we're co-creating with God. If you believe in God, you don't have to, but we're co-creating with the forces that created us.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway,
Absolutely.
This is how I ramble. This is how I roll.
I love it. It's great. And I think you touched on so many themes and subjects that, I intended to ask you a question about anyway. And I think, you're really speaking to what I am attempting to do here in this podcast. You're speaking to it very eloquently. All the stuff that you said resonates with me, and stressing the importance of all of these different pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And you keep coming back to learning, curiosity, openness. How do I learn how to be open? I think you're very attuned to the importance, the value of multiple perspectives. You've rattled off all these different people who are amazing thinkers who've thought seriously about these subjects, these things, and you're open to having dialogue or conversations with these people. Even if they're dead, you can take their literature and have a conversation with these folks from different walks of life, very different perspectives.
Yeah.
And you're expanding your view or your understanding such that doesn't lead you to say that I got to figure it out now. I am the wise one. I love what you said. At the end, you're like, I don't know. That's so beautiful. And I think that's such a big lesson to learn, everyone. It's not about, I got to figure it out. Listen to this man who's lived, how do you say, you're in your 80s or 70s?
77.
How old are you?
And 77.
77, studying life of learning, and can still say, I don't know. And doesn't mean that by saying I don't know that it takes away responsibility. No, you're saying it. You even said that everyone needs a therapist. I need a therapist. Of course, but you therapize yourself because you start to ask yourself, why am I doing this? And I think I always say, like, a therapist keeps you honest. And if you can keep yourself honest, you don't necessarily have to have one. Yeah, some can be very beneficial because of their education and learning how to help you keep yourself honest. But that's a big lesson to learn for all of us. These things that you're saying, that I don't know. I'm open to learning. I'm still making mistakes. I'm still failing. It's making me stronger, as Babaji said. I'm still all these things, figuring out how to interact, how to better interact. What is my story? Where's the story coming from? How am I showing up? And stressing the value and the value and importance of education and how to learn. And I think, and something I was going to ask you about, and you brought it up about relationships. Like, this is all about relationships. We wouldn't be here without cooperation. If we would not have cooperated with each other as a species, for instance, we wouldn't be here. It's a part of our evolutionary experience. I know sometimes they get reduced to genes and one individual self. I think that's what happens when we have that tunnel vision that you're speaking to. A lot of scientists who see things very narrowly. This is a physical world, and that's it. That's how, and they'll just do anything to, I'll say anything to conform to this opinion about how the world is and what the world is, a philosophical opinion, a metaphysical opinion, such that they won't even uh, uh, um, include this idea that you're bringing up, the how culture, how the context also drives evolution, also drives us, not just our genes and the environment, but what is also creating an environment is human choice. And you're brought up the idea of being aware of our choices, being sensitive to our choices. Why am I choosing to do the things that I'm doing? It's not that it's just our genes, that genes are coded to make proteins. Genes don't necessarily have agency in and of itself by itself. It's responding to an environment. And we all have a mind. We all have a sense of self. We can philosophically debate about how real that sense of self is. But there's a sense of self there. And we know that we choose. And we know that we have um, multiple things that we can choose from. But what led me to choose that thing? I might be predisposed to choose one path. Why am I predisposed to choose? And again, it keeps coming back to these things that you're saying, curiosity. Keep asking the question, being aware, being sensitive, and think about the bigger context. What is it all about? And these relationships being related to others. Can you say a few more words about um, relationships and how that? And you already touched on it, but I would love to. And we're near the end here, but for you to articulate the value and the importance of relationships and how that relates to your metaphor for the world. I know you've touched on it, but how do you your metaphor, your metaphysics, or your whatever, your foundational ideas about the world, and why is relationships, why are relationships so important? And it's
Well,
important for us to take into consideration these relationships.
well, I think understanding the impact of relationship is a step to understanding how you're formed. Maturana had some nice things to say about education. You know, one of my favorite quotes from him is a child doesn't learn math, they learn living together with a math teacher. I know. I always get that same response from everybody. It's kind of like, oh, yeah. Children become
So
the
good.
adults they live with. So children are
Yeah.
acculturated in an invisible way in that relationship. And psychology is fundamentally based on that. Most of psychology is based on the notion that our relationships at early stages of life, our culture and context at early stages of life drives a worldview. Now, some escape and move in their own ways, but I deal in the Indian culture quite a bit, and I have spent roughly about 4.5 of the last 6 months there, and I'm about to go back. Um, there's a very strong culture there, which now, for the first time, because of the imposition of social media and communication around the world, the young people are beginning to question long-standing values in terms of relationship with family and so on, that is quite disquieting to the elders of the community. And I work with a lot of those young people when I'm there. I'm not just at the orphanage, but I also work with various groups like the Youth Alliance and different schools. Um, and so there's a cultural shift happening there now, which always is a bit of an upheaval. But in psychology, basically, when we're looking at um, people usually don't go to a psychologist unless they have some issue, something that's not working for them, something they can't control, or something that's aberrative in some ways to norms that are causing it, or, anxiety or this or that, all the different things that beset human beings. And of course, they always, the system thinking and biology is, well, you're not just an individual, you're produced by a system. So, if we funnel it down, the highest leverage to changing the world is changing how we see the world, changing our epistemology, changing our practice, because what we conserve in our manner of living, everything else changes around what we conserve. So if I conserve anger, I'm going to live in one world because people are going to respond to that. If I conserve being the knower and being right, people are going to respond to that, and I can testify to that from personal experience. Nothing clears the room faster than being right. If we conserve love, which is allowing for the arising of the legitimacy of other, that's going to create a different world. If we're curious about other people, somebody just wrote a book on this. What was it called? Something about being a great communicator. And pretty much, I think, nailed it in terms of knowing what kind of conversation you're in. Is it functional? Is it social? Is it emotional? And matching the other person in the conversation. Of always allowing, or as much as you can, curiosity to be greater than criticality. And this was the work that Peter Block did that changed my life and my teaching, which is putting people in small groups with the aphorism, don't be helpful, or let your curiosity be greater than criticality, and in place of judgment or advice, ask questions of clarification. That one practice changes the world faster than anything I have seen. And so when I facilitate, I always do small groups. And with listening with curiosity greater than criticality, to the extent that you can, it's a practice. But what I discovered was that curiosity is the doorway to empathy in relationships. To ask people significant questions. How are you is not one of them. But if you can find a question that creates intimacy, allows for vulnerability, then that produces an empathetic relationship, as long as you don't give advice or take their story and make it about you and tell them what you would have done or what you did. So I think that there are fairly simple practices that if you try them out, you'll realize that your transformation is the transformation of the people around you. And that's why we have some people that are highly successful relationally, and some of us who are not as successful relationally, who have to suffer in isolation, because we're not getting the responses that we need to feel good about ourselves, because we're not putting it out. That's without blame and judgment. This is not your fault. Anybody listening to me, it's not your fault, but it is going to turn out to be your responsibility. So let us forgive one another for the way we are right now, and assume, that we can make small shifts. Change is incremental, and it's not all good or all bad. We don't fight about good versus evil. We fight about competing notions of the good.
Yeah.
So we need to be in dialogue to figure out what that good is that somebody is seeking and why they're seeking it. And then maybe, when it might come out with a lot of anger because there's a lot of fear, but how do we not fear disappearing ourselves in front of that and stay awake and ask questions of clarification, like, why is that important to you? Or tell me more. And asking deeper questions that connect us as human beings. find things that you care about, that we care about together. I think we're more similar than different for the most part, but we're
Yeah.
not pointing positive. We're pointing negative right now. And we're deeply
Mm-hmm.
afraid of each other. So relationship is everything. And what we're doing is we're packing up. We have what are called common criteria of validation. And we build communities around common criteria of validation, and we live in echo chambers. And that's totally
Mm-hmm.
understandable. Culture is so important to all of us. But how can we welcome the stranger? How can we welcome somebody in who might be different, or at least not throw things over the wall at them? You
Yeah.
know. So yeah, it's a relational world, but it's not just a relation between human beings. It's a relationship between humans and animals, humans and nature, human and, I mean, you name it. We are all in relationship, and we're impacting each other. And it's getting harder and harder to find our way through because there's vested interest in the way the things are the way they are. There's deeply vested interests. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. So we need different narratives, new stories. But which ones will take hold? Most of the people say probably the new mythology needs to have something to do with ecology. And I go, yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah.
You know,
Makes sense.
yeah. Mind and nature, mind and nature,
Yes.
this mind and nature. And we're all failing. All of us are failing in
Oh
some
yeah.
ways or
Mm.
another. And collectively, some are failing more obviously than others, but collectively, oh my God, what do we do with so
Yeah.
many of us now?
Mm-hmm.
That we can actually change the weather. Who could imagine that? They say you can never control the weather.
Yeah, I know, right?
Oops.
Yeah.
We can't
Whoops.
control what it
Exactly.
does, but we're controlling the nature of what it does. So I don't know.
Exactly.
I'm all over the map. I'm interested in most everything, but seeing the connections, seeing the patterns,
Yep.
you know. Anyway,
Yep.
now I told you everything I know.
This is. Oh, I know there's more there, but this is just awesome. And yeah, we're at the end here, and this is awesome. I mean, we can just keep doing this because you have so much wisdom to share. I knew it. I know there's more there. But is there any final words that you would like to offer the audience?
Yeah,
Any final words that you would like
I
to
would
offer? Yeah.
quote Shama Metre: "Know yourself." That's it. Know yourself,
Awesome.
and with that, you will develop the capacity to make better distinctions. And in that, in knowing yourself and how you see the world in your own epistemology, this is the commentary on her comment. You will develop the capacity to know the world that you live in a little bit better. And that will make a difference. So you have to do the work. And I don't mean to incapacitate yourself with constant questioning. Nobody can do that. Forgive yourself for mistakes. Keep trying. Fail your way to success. Yeah. That's my motto. There's so much in the course of my life I have to answer for and am answering for in some ways. And I just hope to create less mayhem as I go along. This podcast notwithstanding. So I apologize for any confusion I've sown in the audience. God bless you all. I hope you figure out all the things I'm trying to figure out, and someday we get to meet. And Broderick, thank you for the opportunity to learn, to learn. The person talking is learning the most.
Oh, isn't it? Man, you my man. That's in you. I'm with you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, and audience. I hope you've enjoyed that. This has just been a joy and a wonderful time to explore ideas and learn from a great person. So thank you all. Until next time. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. I hope this conversation has inspired you to reflect on your own views of the good life. If you enjoyed the show and want to hear more inspiring and thought-provoking conversations, please follow, write a review, and rate us on your favorite podcast app. If you are tuning in on YouTube, please hit that like button and subscribe. Your support is very much appreciated.